Okay, everyone, let's get started. So, last class, we finished with a discussion of Street's evolutionary argument against moral realism. And one of the ways I helped introduce that discussion was the argument from objective morality to the existence of God, which is not something that's testable, but something to maybe help you get interested in these debates. And remember that the first premise of that argument is, if God does not exist, then objective moral values or objective moral truths do not exist. And while Street probably wouldn't put it quite like that, you can see her paper as providing support for that first premise. The main argument we're going to look at today comes from Sam Harris, and you can see him as being someone who rejects that first premise. He thinks that it's possible to have an objective moral framework without appealing to God. So I will say, for whatever it's worth, when I initially lost my faith, I had a Sam Harris phase. Then he and I broke up for various reasons. But this is a very interesting argument he puts forward. At the end, I'm going to give my own thoughts on it. I think it suffers from some pretty serious problems, but it's a view that I think is interesting to discuss. And the textbook mentions it as well, so that's another reason to have a look at it. So as I said at the end of last class as kind of a teaser, what Harris thinks matters morally is states of well-being and suffering. So if it's helpful, you can think of him as a kind of utilitarian, even though he rejects that label. So he thinks that suffering and well-being are what matter. Suffering is objectively bad, well-being is objectively good. And given that states of suffering and happiness depend on our brains, then there are going to be scientifically right and wrong answers about how to increase happiness or how to decrease suffering. That's the zoomed out version. I'll let him explain it himself. This is from a TED Talk he gave. I'm not going to show the whole thing. I'll show some clips that I think bring out the point well. Okay, so very provocatively put, but that should give you a sense of his argument. Now, right off the bat, he said early on something about the relationship between facts and values. And there's one objection we can make off the bat that you should now have the tools to make that relates to something we talked about in Unit 1. What's a problem with construing things in that way?
When it just breaks the is-ought gap.
Yes, so taken at face value, Harris's account would violate the is-ought gap. Right, so he says, look, there are facts about which types of actions tend to increase human well-being. Science can tell us about those facts, therefore science can tell us what we should do. But it's of course missing a premise, which is, we should care about what maximizes human well-being. Now, we may or may not decide that we agree with that premise, but it's not a premise that science can demonstrate is true. Okay. So he mentioned, I wouldn't worry too much about this, but he mentioned the analogy with healthy food as a way of defending his idea that there can be objective claims about what increases or decreases well-being. It may be that well-being is difficult to define precisely, but something similar is true about the concept of health. I think I may have cut it off before he mentioned food, but he talked about how the concept of health is somewhat elastic and open to revision. But there's still an objective difference between healthy food and poison. So there can be clear-cut cases even if the definition is somewhat open to revision. Again, I think I skipped this part for the sake of time, but another term that I added is the analogy with chess. His point here is to make a distinction, I think this is a good distinction to make, between science being an objective domain, and indeed, for Harris, morality being an objective domain, and moral claims being absolute or exceptionless. These are sometimes used interchangeably, but in chess, a principle like don't lose your queen is an objectively good principle. But it's not absolute or exceptionless. There may be some cases where it's actually a good thing to do. So analogously, this would put Harris at odds with someone like Kant, who thinks that moral principles have to be exceptionless. If it's wrong to lie, it's always wrong to lie. So Harris would reject that. Other people, one person that the book mentions alongside Harris is E.O. Wilson. There are other people who've tried to defend the idea that science can tell us what's right and wrong. Many of them, like Wilson and some more unsavory characters, say from the 1800s, think that evolution is the basis of morality, that we can derive values from evolution. In the reading, Harris explicitly rejects that, saying that he's not saying that we should get our values from evolution. He has a kind of funny example, which is, if you think that you should do whatever is evolutionarily advantageous, and that that's what is morally good, then every man should see it as his duty to repeatedly donate to the sperm bank, because then you are increasing your spreading of your genes, but I don't think anyone thinks that's a sound basis of morality. In the reading, Harris gives two very vivid cases of what he calls the bad life and the good life. One case of a very tragic type of life. So it's a woman in a war-torn environment. I won't read the details, it's pretty graphic and upsetting, but the idea there is this is a case which everyone should agree is bad. And for Harris, he thinks everyone should agree is objectively bad. Now, everyone's going to agree it's very upsetting and leads to a strong emotional response, but his claim is if anything is objectively bad, this life would count. So the premises he asks us to grant are that some lives are better than others, better to live than others. And the differences between a good life and a bad life lawfully relate to states of the brain and states of the world. Right? The laws of nature or the increases in well-being or suffering relate lawfully to states of the brain and states in the wider context. And given that, science can tell us which actions increase well-being or decrease it. And the really bold conclusion that Harris draws from this, which is the subtitle of his book, is that science can tell us what's right and wrong. And here we're going to talk about another objection that a lot of people have made. And to help lead into the objection, I'm going to talk about a narrow versus a broad definition of science. So a narrow conception of science would be thinking of it in terms of things like empirical studies, experiments, mathematical modeling, and stuff like that. This would be more the ordinary sense of the term. But what Harris says is, when the subtitle of his book is How Science Can Determine Human Values, what he means by science is really just human rationality broadly construed. His definition is broad enough that, for example, it would include philosophy. But what many people have pointed out is that feels like a bit of a bait and switch. The title is very grabby, like, ooh, science can tell us what's right and wrong, and that's a very provocative claim. But then when you push back, he'll retreat to saying, well, I mean human rationality broadly construed. And then it's not that surprising. No one denies that, philosophy has something to say about morality. Or at least, it would not be a very provocative subtitle to say, philosophy can, tell us what's right and wrong. That would be less provocative. One person who raised this objection is Brian Earp. Now, at the time, he was just a graduate student. He now has his PhD and has done actually, I would say some of the most important work in moral psychology. There will be some readings from Earp later in the course. At the time, he was just a graduate student. By the way, if you want to depress yourself immensely, well, at least it depressed me immensely when I was a graduate student, look up Brian Earp's CV on Google Scholar or somewhere, where he has a list of publications. It's like dozens every year. And like good stuff, and often he's the first author. So, very prolific person. So here's a quick video of him. He happened to be attending a talk by Harris and asked a very pointed question related to the distinction between a broad and narrow conception of science. So notice what he says in response to the question. He says, the moment you grant morality is about well-being, then blah, 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 blah. But the whole point is, science can't give you that premise. I'll make this concrete with an example, for those of you who like it when I use a syllogism to bear this out. Think about his, the case of corporal punishment in the classroom. So he doesn't have studies on this, but let's just suppose that science shows that corporal punishment decreases well-being. So let's say we put together a large body of evidence that shows that. The only way to move from that to science shows that you shouldn't do corporal punishment in the classroom is to have the premise, the other premise, you shouldn't or ought not to, or it's wrong to, or whatever, do things that decrease well-being. And again, the point of the question is, science can't tell you that premise 2 is true. Premise 2 is a philosophical premise. Now, one thing you could do, and this is where let's pause. I put a lot on the table. Any questions about what I've said so far? Yeah.
Can you just really quickly go over narrow versus broad definition?
Yeah, for sure. So a narrow conception, which I think is the more defensible one, it's certainly the one that corresponds with ordinary usage, would be a conception of science as an empirical discipline where you do experiments, analyze data, model things mathematically, and so on. A broad conception, which is the one Harris appeals to, at least it's the one he appeals to when he's pressed, is just human rationality broadly construed. So it includes science, but also philosophy and other forms of rational inquiry. Okay, so good question. Any other questions? Yeah?
In the second premise in the key terms, these differences lawfully relate to states of brain and states of the world. What does lawfully mean?
Lawfully mean in terms of the laws of nature. So the laws of nature dictate how states of well-being emerge or fail to emerge. Yep.
So, from what I've understood, he seems to be very much like a scientific realist.
He's definitely a scientific realist. Yeah.
Science will always find the truth. Would that still be the case if he's talking about science in a broad sense? Given that philosophy isn't really that scientific, would that still count as being important?
I think Harris is, so for those of you who don't know, so this is something I talk about in Psych 405. Scientific realism is the view that scientific theories are at least approximately true. So some people think that science is just a set of tools for making predictions, but it's not aiming at getting at the truth about the world. And Harris would certainly count as a scientific realist. I think your other question was, is he a realist about philosophy? Does philosophy get at truths about the world? And I think there, yes, he would also say that it, at least in principle, can get at truths about the world. Yep.
Could you go over the difference between objective truth and absolute truth?
Yeah, of course. So objective just means, if a truth is objective, it means it's true whether or not anyone thinks it. So like the Earth orbits the sun. That's true. It was true before anyone thought it. For Harris, moral claims are like that. So think of the slavery case, right? So Harris would say, if everyone believes slavery is okay, well, they're just wrong. You know, it's true whether or not, the wrongness of slavery is true whether or not anyone thinks it. Absolute means exceptionless. So there are moral principles that admit of no exceptions. So something like Kant's view that if lying is wrong, then it's always wrong, that would be a kind of absolutist kind of morality. And Harris doesn't want to endorse that. Is there another hand? Okay. So, one thing you could do is say, okay, fine, we do need a philosophical premise in order for science to tell us what's right or wrong. We have to first grant the premise that you shouldn't do things that detract from well-being. But one thing we could do is say, okay, forget about his claim that science can tell us what's objectively right or wrong. Do we want to go along with his moral realism? And again, when he's pressed, one of his favorite arguments to use is the worst possible misery for everyone. So he asks you to imagine a state of the world where everyone suffers as much as they possibly can for as long as they possibly can. And then he'll say, that's bad. Surely we can agree that that's bad. If anything is objectively bad, that is. And therefore, it's better to move away from that state. Now, so this is my own view on this. I agree that that's bad in the sense that it strikes me with great emotional force, to quote Street. I certainly don't want a world that involves the worst possible misery for everyone. But I don't think it makes sense to say it's objectively bad. And the point that brought it home for me was, you can imagine two different people looking at two worlds. So let's say there's, suffering world, Harris's world, and happy world. So let's say it's me and a psychopath are looking at these two worlds from the outside. So in the first world, everyone suffers as much as they can for as long as they can. In the second world, everyone's happy. And I say, yeah, I'd rather create the happy world. That's a better world. It's the kind of world I would want to help create if I was in it. Whereas this world kind of sucks. I don't like that world. And the psychopath says, no, I like the first world. That world's great. I would like to make the world closer to that. If you're a moral realist, you have to say that there's some fact that the psychopath is wrong about. Right? If you're a moral realist, then morality is an objective domain of objective facts. And it seems to me, if you think about this, that the psychopath and I could agree on all of the facts. We could, let's say these are two real worlds. We're standing outside of it, looking at them. We could both know all of the truths about each world, but have a different moral belief about them. So, may or may not be convinced, but for me, this is a convincing argument that morality is ultimately a matter of our values and preferences, not a matter of objective truth. You don't have to agree with me on that, and I will note, actually, a majority of philosophers, there's some interesting polling on this, still do endorse moral realism. Not a huge majority, but still a majority. And I will confess that for a long time it worried me, the idea that morality might not be objective. And the biggest concern I had was worrying that this means that you can't be against stuff as viscerally. Like the one people always talk about is the Nazis, right? Can you say the Nazis were objectively wrong? And everyone, hopefully, wants to say that. And if we think morality is a matter of preference, does that change how we react to a case like that? What helped me with it was, look, even though morality is, in my view, a matter of preferences, you can still care deeply enough about them to go fight the Nazis. The fact that there's not some platonic objective truth about whether the Nazis are right doesn't mean we hate them any less. It's up to us how much we care about our moral values. But that's not testable, that's just a conclusion I came to. One other connection you could make, and someone asked about this in a prior class, is a connection to reflective equilibrium, which is something Tiberius, the author of the textbook, will return to a lot. So, because another thing people worry about is if we're not moral realists, does that mean we can't reason about morality? Does it mean do we just have to like scream our emotions at each other, like boo, yay, and no? Does it mean there's no room for debate? But both a moral realist and an anti-realist can engage in the process of reflective equilibrium. The difference will, so even if we grant, if we're not moral realists, that at bottom it's a matter of emotion and preference, so in other words, these intuitions are kind of visceral judgments we make, we can still choose to reason about them and try and make them consistent. The moral realist will say, look, these intuitions track some kind of objective moral truth, and then we're systematizing them. But both can endorse the use of reason. Okay. That's all I have to say about the Harris reading. Hopefully you found the debate interesting, but any questions about the terms related to that? Yep.
Can you go over the moral landscape?
Yeah, so the term moral landscape, this is Harris's kind of visual metaphor for his view. So where the peaks correspond to heights of well-being, and the depths correspond to states of the world with lots of suffering. And his claim is science can tell us how best to navigate this space. So, it's kind of fun, a silly example, dumping cholera in the water. We know as a scientific fact it's going to move us down if we do something like that. Having rule of law as a society probably going to help move us up. So the initial motivation for going into this topic was, or at least for me, and I mentioned it, was the connection to religion. But this is an empirical class, at least it's supposed to be partly an empirical class. So the next two readings are about empirical research into the relationship between moral behavior and religion. So we're no longer concerned about what's objectively true about morality or religion, but just how does religious belief and religious practice contribute to moral behavior. So the first reading is from Azim Sharif, who's a prof at UBC. So he's one of the world's experts on the psychology of religion. I can't help but note, and this doesn't, I don't think, detract from the paper, but this paper was edited by Francesca Gino. Did you hear about Francesca Gino? One person. So she was a Harvard psychologist. I think she had a position in the business department, but whatever. She's a psychological researcher. And her main area of expertise was honesty, at least one of them. And one of her papers on honesty, all the data were made up. It's too perfect. And now she did sue Harvard for firing her over this, so maybe hopefully this video doesn't go viral or something, but I don't want to get sued. But they had a several 100-page long investigation into it. Looks pretty conclusive that, again, she faked data in a study about dishonesty. Now she just edited the paper, she didn't do any of the research, so I don't think it detracts from it, but kind of a funny story. Unless, of course, you're co-authors. Then it's not so funny. Okay, so the first finding that the book talks, that the paper talks about, religious people on average are more likely to endorse, and it's not that they know philosophy, but if you give them dilemmas or questions that get at this, they are more likely to have a deontological as opposed to utilitarian orientation, and more likely to have an objectivist, he calls it objectivist, which is basically the same as moral realism, or realist conception of morality. So whether or not God's existence is required for moral realism to be true, it's empirically the case that religious people are more likely to endorse, moral realism. Now actually, I don't think moral realism is true whether or not God exists, but that's for another class. And with regard to the first one, so religious people are more likely to say that if something is wrong, it's always wrong. They're more likely to endorse moral principles and not think that morality is about consequences, about things like increasing happiness or decreasing suffering. Obviously, just on average, but that's one finding. Another finding, which should be unsurprising given what we saw in the political sphere, the pattern of religious people's endorsement of moral foundations, so remember Haidt's 5 moral foundations, it's pretty similar to the pattern of conservatives' endorsement of moral foundations. So religious people are more likely to endorse the last 3, right? Loyalty, then authority, and purity, than secular people are. So there's a chart in the paper finding that religious people care pretty much equally about fairness and care relative to secular people, but they also care more about loyalty, authority, and purity. The purity one is the biggest effect as far as how much more religious people care about it. Secular people care about it almost not at all, on average. Okay, what about pro-social behavior? Things like giving to charity, volunteering in the community, things like that. So I don't have a dog in this fight, I'm an atheist, but here there's quite a large body of evidence indicating that on average, religious people do give more to charity and engage in more pro-social behavior. So based on one study with a large sample, among those who pray every day, 83% give to charity. Among those who never pray, it's closer to 50%. So a pretty big effect by the standards of psychology. One thing you may wonder is, okay, is that just about giving to religious charity? Isn't that kind of biasing it? But even if you say, no, forget about giving to your temple or mosque or church, how much do you give to secular charities? And a gap still remains in the same direction. Religious people are more likely to say they give even to non-religious charities. Now, one paradox that the paper explores a bit is this does not seem to replicate in the lab with sort of, what's the right term to use? With cases of giving in the lab. So you're paired with someone in like an economic game or something like that. Are religious people more likely to give there? And there, generally speaking, you don't find an effect. So what's going on there? So one explanation is that part of the difference between religious people and non-religious people in self-reported charitable donations could be due to social desirability. There's some evidence that religious people are, on average, more likely to engage in socially desirable responding, so kind of saying what the experimenter thinks they want to hear. A different explanation that I think is probably better is that part of what drives greater religious charitable donation is the kind of religious rituals, and that putting someone in a lab is kind of the wrong context to look for an effect unless you introduce something like religious priming in the study. So if you prime people with religious concepts, so like you have them, so there's 2 conditions. One of them you unscramble a bunch of religious words, and the other condition you don't. Subtle things like that. You do find that religious priming increases giving in these kind of economic gain or lab situations, but only for religious people. So when it says the effect of priming religiosity on pro-social behavior, that's what I'm referring to. That's what that key term is about. Okay, any questions about that reading? Okay. To reinforce that point, I have a video from actually the author of my the first intro psych textbook I read back in the Pleistocene age, David Myers, talking about some other lines of evidence for at least some connection between a religious orientation and certain kinds of pro-social behavior. Okay, so in that talk, he covered a lot of the same types of evidence. It looks like we're almost out of time. I'll just quickly flag one thing, which is, so next class, so when it comes to the relationship between religiosity and charitable donations, volunteering, it's pretty uniformly positive. Next class we'll look at the relationship between religious orientation and prejudice. And here, the answer is going to be, it depends which kind of religious orientation we're talking about. Not meaning which religion specifically, but within each religion, which type of orientation. So there's a little teaser for next class. We'll stop there.